The sun drifted low over the open plain, settling into the kind of warm, honey-gold light that softened even the hardest edges of the frontier. Dust rose in slow, lazy swirls around the small cabin perched on the ridge, a lone wooden shell standing against a vast world that rarely paused to notice the quiet souls within it. Evelyn Hart stepped out into that fading light with a tin bucket in hand, her steps steady, her posture straight, though solitude had long ago pressed its cool fingers around her life. At 22, she carried herself with the practiced calm of someone who had learned not to expect much from others, yet still cradled a tender hope she would never admit to anyone. Her dress fluttered gently against her legs, pale blue fabric worn thin at the seams, but clean, cared for, meaningful in its simplicity. The land around her answered only with wind and drifting sage. It was not silence that weighed on her, but the kind of loneliness that stretched thin over the years, a quiet she had grown familiar with, even dependent on. After her parents died and the man who once swore affection chose a wealthier woman, she found the safest path was the narrow one leading back to herself. She worked, she survived, she kept to her own rhythm. People in town called her the Ridge Girl in soft tones, affectionate but distant, as though she were some gentle animal that might run at a wrong step. She never ran. She simply walked her life with a tender resilience that made her both strong and fragile at once. Her afternoons were predictable. She fetched water from the creek, tended to her small garden, stitched garments for whoever had coins to spare. Old Martha Calloway visited once a week with biscuits and worry lines etched deeper than her wrinkles deserved. The sheriff stopped by occasionally to ask if she needed help chopping wood, though she always refused with a smile. The world spun on in its rustic rhythm, and she floated through it with an acceptance that felt almost peaceful. But sometimes, when the light slanted just right or the wind shifted in from the south, Evelyn felt eyes upon her. Calm, steady, not unkind. It was never threatening, never sharp. Only present. Watching. Waiting. A presence she sensed, not saw, like a deep chord resonating through the land itself. She told herself it was imagination, something born of too many evenings spent alone on the porch with nothing but her thoughts for company. One late afternoon, as she knelt beside her garden pulling weeds from the stubborn soil, she felt that sensation again. A quiet awareness, as if the earth behind her had shifted. She turned only slightly, pretending to reach for another clump of weeds, but what she found instead was a brief glimpse of a tall figure on the distant ridge. Not close. Not approaching. Just standing against the bleeding sky, still as a carved monument, dark hair stirring in the breeze. She blinked, and he was gone. Or perhaps he had never been there at all. Her heart fluttered in her chest with an unfamiliar unrest, something between curiosity and caution. She carried her bucket toward the creek as the air cooled. Crickets began their nighttime chorus, and the sky deepened from gold to amber to a dusky lavender. Evelyn moved with a calm grace, her senses heightened by that lingering feeling of being observed. When she reached the water's edge, she knelt and dipped her bucket, watching the surface ripple gently around her hands. The world here always felt softer, sheltered by cottonwoods and the slow whisper of flowing water. Yet tonight the hush felt charged, as though some quiet truth pressed against its own boundary. A faint rustle broke the stillness. Evelyn stiffened, her fingers freezing around the handle. She lifted her gaze and saw him clearly this time, just beyond the tree line, half-shadowed, half-lit by the remaining band of sunlight. A man of immense height, broad-shouldered, his chest bare, skin bronzed and marked with faint tribal paint. Long black hair fell in loose braids against his back. His presence was powerful, yet there was nothing predatory in his stance. He watched her with eyes that held the depth of a long-traveled river, ancient and patient. Evelyn's breath hitched, but she did not run. She could not. Something in those eyes told her she was safe, though she didn't understand why. She stood slowly, gripping the bucket tighter. The man did not move. Not an inch. He simply regarded her with the quiet intensity of someone who had waited a long time to be seen. She opened her mouth to speak, though she didn't know what words might come, but he dipped his head once in a gesture so gentle it confused her. Then, like mist dissolving into dusk, he stepped back into the trees and disappeared without sound. The forest swallowed him whole. Evelyn stood alone, the world holding its breath around her. Her pulse thundered in her ears, but not from fear. From recognition. As if something old had awakened inside her, something she had buried beneath layers of solitude. She walked home beneath the rising moon, her thoughts drifting in tangled threads she could not unravel. Who was he? Why had he been watching her? And why, instead of dread, did she feel an unexpected stirring in her chest, a sense that her life had tilted slightly off its familiar axis? When she reached her cabin, she paused at the porch. Something lay on the step. At first she thought it was a twig blown by the wind, but when she picked it up, her breath caught. It was a small charm, woven from leather and beads, crafted in a style she recognized from the Apache people who lived miles beyond the ridge. A symbol of protection. A silent gesture. Her fingers trembled around it. The night deepened. A coyote cried somewhere in the distance, and the wind curled around her like a whispered warning, or a promise. Evelyn stepped inside and closed the door, her heart beating far too fast. For the first time in years, she did not feel entirely alone. Something had shifted. Someone had stepped into her story. Morning crept over the ridge in a wash of soft amber, warming the plains of Evelyn's face as she stepped out of her cabin with a basket of mended clothes tucked beneath her arm. The charm she had found the night before rested in her apron pocket, the leather warm from her nervous touch. She didn't understand why she had kept it so close, only that removing it felt wrong, like denying something she had not yet named. The land stretched quiet around her, dew glittering on the grass, and the wind moved with a hush that carried both peace and hidden tension, as though the world watched her with breath held. The walk to town took nearly an hour, the path winding past cottonwoods and tall grasses swaying in a slow rhythmic dance. She felt eyes on her again, soft, familiar, unthreatening. She didn't turn. Part of her feared she would find nothing, and another part feared she would. The memory of the giant Apache man lingered too vividly, his presence pressed into her thoughts like a handprint left in wet clay. She tried to shake it off, but her heart kept circling back to him, to the silent way he had looked at her, not with hunger or judgment, but with a kind of reverence that unsettled her more deeply than any danger would have. The town stirred with its usual morning bustle when she arrived. Wagons rattled by, shopkeepers swept dust from their doorways, and the smell of freshly baked bread curled through the air. People greeted her with nods and gentle smiles, but she could always sense the distance behind their eyes, the way they viewed her life as something fragile and lonely. She delivered the mended clothes to Mrs. Thompson, accepted a few coins, and made her way toward the general store, when she heard a familiar voice that instantly tightened her chest. Caleb Rourke leaned casually against the hitching post outside the saloon, the morning sun catching on his polished boots and well-kept vest. Once, long ago, she had mistaken his charm for sincerity. She had believed the softness in his voice meant something, until he chose a richer woman, without a moment's hesitation. Now, whenever their paths crossed, he offered her a smile that pretended friendliness but never reached his eyes. "Well, if it ain't the Ridge girl," he drawled, pushing off the post with practiced ease. "Didn't expect to see you this early." She kept her voice steady, though irritation pinched her thoughts. "Morning, Caleb." He stepped closer, too close, his tone dipped in mock sweetness. "You still living out there all alone? Dangerous place for a woman, you know. Folks talk." "Let them," she replied, heading for the store. But he slid in beside her, determined to steal her peace. "You know, Evelyn, you could have had an easier life if you played your cards right. I was willing once. Still might be if you—" She didn't stay to hear the rest. She stepped inside the general store, and let the door swing sharply behind her, cutting off his voice. Her hands trembled as she selected flour and beans, forcing herself to breathe evenly. His presence always dredged up old insecurities she thought she'd buried. Proof that even in a town filled with kind eyes, cruelty waited in small, sharpened shadows. When she stepped back outside, she froze. The air shifted. People glanced nervously toward the far end of the street, parting like grass before a storm. A tall figure approached, towering above the milling crowd, every step slow and deliberate. Tawoti. Shirtless beneath the sun, muscles carved in bold lines, braids swaying against his back. His gaze swept the street with a calm so profound it unsettled anyone who bore guilt in their heart. Yet when his eyes found Evelyn, something in their depths softened. Not visibly, not outwardly, but in a way she felt rather than saw. Caleb stiffened near the saloon steps, a flicker of unease crossing his face. Tewodi did not approach directly. He merely moved through town with the steady confidence of a man who owed no apology for his presence. He stopped a few steps from Evelyn, close enough for her to feel the quiet power radiating from him like heat off sun-baked stone. He looked at the bag in her hands and then at her, as though checking for harm. She swallowed, her breath catching in the space between them. "You dropped this," he said softly, holding out a folded cloth she hadn't even noticed falling. His voice was low, shaped by earth and wind, warm in a way that surprised her. She took it, murmuring thanks. Her fingers brushed his for a heartbeat, just enough to send a ripple of something through her chest, something she couldn't define. Tewodi nodded as though satisfied, then moved on, his presence leaving a wake of murmured whispers behind him. Caleb sneered toward her. "You be careful around men like that, Evelyn. They ain't." She cut him a sharp look, and for once he fell silent. She walked away, her pulse thrumming, trying to steady her thoughts as she began the long journey home. Halfway along the ridge trail, she paused. Her bucket from earlier sat overturned on the path where she dropped it that morning. She reached for it, but before she could lift it, a shadow fell across the dust. Tewodi knelt silently and righted the bucket for her, his hand engulfing the handle with effortless strength. She had not heard him approach. He offered no explanation for his presence, only the quiet assistance of someone who had chosen to watch over her from a distance few would dare. "You should not walk alone so often," he said, eyes scanning the horizon. "There is restlessness here." Her breath trembled. "Restlessness?" He nodded once. "Men without honor. Tracks where they shouldn't be." A chill touched her despite the sun. He held her gaze for a long, steady moment, long enough for her to feel that this was not a warning spoken lightly. Without another word, he turned and disappeared into the tall grass, his towering form swallowed by the swaying blades. But she sensed him nearby still, moving parallel to her path, silent as a promise. When Evelyn reached her cabin at dusk, the world felt heavier, as though something unseen lingered just beyond the edges of the darkening sky. She stepped onto her porch and stopped cold. A single footprint, far larger than her own, pressed deep into the dirt outside her door. Fresh. Unfamiliar. Not Tewodi's. Her heart clenched as shadows gathered around the ridge, pressing close. And in the stillness, she realized the land was no longer watching her in silence. It was warning her. The days after Evelyn found the strange footprint unfolded with a sharpened sense of watchfulness, as though the earth itself held its breath beneath her steps. She moved through her morning tasks with attention she couldn't quite name, glancing toward the tree line every few moments as if a shadow might detach from the forest and walk toward her. Tewodi's warning lingered like a soft echo. Men without honor, tracks where they shouldn't be, yet it was the quiet certainty in his eyes that troubled her most. She trusted her own strength, but the ridge felt different now, charged with unspoken danger. That afternoon, she walked to the creek with a basket of laundry, hoping the sound of running water would steady her thoughts. The air hung warm and still, carrying the scent of wild mint and sun-warmed stone. Birdsong fluttered between branches, yet beneath the gentle music hid a subtle disquiet, a soundless pressure that made her heart pulse with unease. She had just knelt beside the water when a twig snapped behind her. Sharp, deliberate, too close. Evelyn froze, her hands stilling against the wet cloth. Another step shifted the brush, and a voice slurred from the trees, thick with drink. "Well now, look what luck blew our way." 3 men emerged from the brush, their clothes dusty, their eyes bright with the recklessness of travelers who had been too long without purpose. Evelyn's breath hitched as they fanned around her, not touching, not threatening in words, yet carrying the dangerous ease of men who believed no one would stop them. "You're a pretty thing to be all alone," the first man murmured, leaning too near. Evelyn steadied her voice. "I'm not alone." Her words were brave, but her hands trembled, and the men noticed with a smirk that slid like oil over their faces. "Well," another laughed, "we don't see anyone else here." Before Evelyn could answer, the forest shifted. Not with sound, but with presence. a dense stillness that rolled over the creek like a silent storm. The men felt it too, their smiles fading as their eyes darted toward the trees. A shadow moved there, massive, measured, inevitable. Tawodi stepped from the brush with the quiet surety of a mountain learning to walk, his chest bare, braids dark against his shoulders, his eyes locked not on Evelyn, but on the men who had closed her in. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The sheer scale of him, the calm in his stance, sent a ripple through the air, a warning as clear as thunder. The first man took a half-step back, his bravado crumbling. "We didn't mean no harm," he stammered, but Tawodi's silence cut through the lie. Evelyn felt her breath shiver as Tawodi moved to stand between her and the men, his towering frame casting a cool shadow over her. Still he said nothing, yet the air around him seemed to hum with contained power. The men, no longer so bold, backed away in uneven steps. When they finally turned and fled into the trees, the forest breathed again. Evelyn realized she had been holding her own breath, her hands still submerged in the cool water. Tawodi looked down at her, his eyes softening with something that felt strangely like understanding. "You should not come here alone," he said quietly. The words were simple, but they settled into her chest like steady hands. He walked her home at a distance, never close enough to make her feel crowded, never far enough that she felt unprotected. Evelyn stole glances over her shoulder, watching the way his stride matched the slow rhythm of the land itself. His presence didn't frighten her. Instead it stilled the unease that had shadowed her since the footprint. When they reached the ridge, the sun hung low, painting the world in soft rose and amber. Tawodi stopped several paces behind her cabin. "You are watched," he said, voice barely above the wind. Evelyn's pulse quickened. "By who?" He shook his head. "Not my people. Men I do not know. They came near your door last night." The world narrowed to a cold thread running down her spine. She swallowed. "Why are you following me?" Tawodi's expression shifted, not with embarrassment but with a quiet truth. "You walk alone. The ridge is not safe." Evelyn looked away, her heart unsteady. "Many women walk alone." He stepped closer, not invading but anchoring the air between them. "Not like you." She didn't know what he meant, yet the words moved through her like a wind stirring something long asleep. Tawodi took one last look around her home, his eyes sharp with protective alertness. Then he turned to leave. That night, Evelyn lay awake, listening to the whispers of wind against the cabin walls. Every shadow seemed to shift with intent, every sound felt like a footstep taken too close. Yet beneath the fear ran a strange warmth, the memory of Tawodi standing between her and danger, silent as a vow. She had never been protected like that, not even by those who claimed to care for her. The thought settled into her heart, heavy and unexpected. When sleep finally dragged her under, dreams rose in gentle shapes. She stood on the ridge beneath a storm-dark sky, wind whipping her hair around her face. In the distance, lightning split the clouds, but a shadow stood before her, unmoving. Tawodi! His silhouette blocked the storm, shielding her from the wind's bite. She reached for him, fingers stretching toward the warmth of his chest, and the moment they touched, the storm stilled. Her eyes flew open to moonlight pooling across her floor. A shadow moved outside, slow, deliberate, human. Not Tawodi. Not a dream. Footsteps crunched in the dirt, circling her cabin with something hungry behind them. Evelyn pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle a cry, heart pounding like hooves. Then a thud landed against her door, a warning or a promise she couldn't yet understand. The knock, or whatever weight had struck her door, echoed through Evelyn's cabin long after the sound faded. She stayed frozen beneath her quilt, breath thin, eyes locked on the trembling moonlit silhouette of the doorframe. She waited for another thud, another sign of unwelcome presence, but none came. The silence that followed was worse. A silence thick with the knowledge that someone had been inches from her, someone bold enough to circle her home in darkness. Sleep abandoned her entirely. When dawn came, pale and hesitant, she stepped outside with cautious feet and found the footprints again. Deeper this time, more deliberate, circling her porch like a predator testing the resolve of its prey. She crouched, fingers hovering over the tracks as if touching them might summon the man who made them. The prints weren't Tewoti's. She knew his stride, the width of his steps. These belonged to someone smaller, but reckless, someone willing to come close. Her throat tightened. The ridge had become a stage for dangers she couldn't yet see. She tried to move through her day, sweeping her porch, tending her garden, mending a torn shirt, but every small sound snapped her attention toward the tree line. The unease bloomed inside her like a thorn opening. By midday she decided the solitude was too heavy, too sharp, and she walked toward town once more, hoping company might warm the chill gripping her thoughts. Yet town offered no comfort. Caleb Rourke leaned against the saloon again, his expression smug, though his eyes held a glint that unsettled her more than usual. He approached before she could avoid him, his steps too casual, his smile sour. "Heard you've been having visitors up on that ridge," he said, rolling the words like a secret he enjoyed holding. "Strangers creeping around your place. Shame you live so far from people willing to help." She stiffened. "You know who they are?" He shrugged, the gesture too careless to be honest. "Men come and go. Some are just passing through. Some looking for softer ground." His eyes dipped to her hands, then returned to her face. "Women living alone make easy marks. Folks talk. Maybe you should think about moving closer to town." Evelyn felt heat rise in her chest. "I don't need advice from you." Caleb's smile thinned. "You don't have to pretend you're strong all the time, Evelyn. People like you always break eventually." The words hit deeper than he knew, stirring old hurts until she turned sharply and walked away, ignoring him calling something after her, the tone too light for the darkness threading his meaning. She finished her errands quickly, refusing to linger where rumor and pity were thick in the air. When she headed toward the ridge again, the sky had grown heavy with late afternoon light. Shadows stretched long and creeping across the land. Halfway up the trail, fear prickled her skin. Someone was following her. The crunch of distant steps echoed faintly behind her, stopping when she stopped, moving when she moved. She forced herself not to look back, her breath thin as wire. She hadn't seen Tewoti all day, though she searched for his silhouette in every ripple of grass, every sway of cottonwood. It struck her then, how much safer she felt when his presence hovered nearby, even unspoken. That realization unsettled her almost as much as the footsteps did. She quickened her pace. The steps behind her quickened too. Evelyn reached her cabin just as dusk bled into the sky, painting it in bruised purples. She ducked inside and bolted the door, leaning against it with trembling limbs. Minutes passed before she dared peek out the window. No one stood outside. The ridge lay quiet beneath the dying light. Yet her heart refused to calm. Night was already folding its wings over the land when she heard a soft tap on the wall behind her cabin. A sound so faint she barely caught it. She held her breath. Another tap followed, this one nearer the window. She stepped back, pulse thrashing. Then silence. Long, choking silence. She pressed both hands to her mouth, stifling a cry when the doorknob twitched. Not violently. Not even firmly. Just enough to test. Just enough to know. Evelyn backed away slowly until her spine brushed the far wall. Whoever stood outside wasn't trying to break in, not yet. They only wanted her to know they were there. She stayed awake until the moon climbed high and cold, the silence deepening like a warning carved into the dark. In the deepest blue before dawn, a shape moved beyond her fence, large, shadowed, familiar. Tewoti stepped into the growing light with slow purpose. Relief rushed through her in a single, shaking exhale. She opened the door before she could think, the cool air hitting her cheeks as he strode toward her. He saw her pale face and the fear trembling through her posture. His eyes darkened with an understanding that needed no explanation. "They came again," he said, not asking but knowing. She nodded, unable to speak. Tewoti walked to the porch edge, crouching to study the ground. Tracks lined the soil, her own, the stranger's, and one more a few feet farther. A deeper print. He touched it lightly. "Caleb," he murmured, voice low as distant thunder. Evelyn felt the world tilt. Caleb was here. Tewoti rose to his full height, towering in the first rays of dawn. His boots. His stride. His jaw tightened. "He watches you," He comes when you sleep. Her stomach turned. Shame, anger, disbelief all tangled inside her. She had thought Caleb cruel, but she had never imagined him lingering at her door like a starving wolf. Tewodi stepped closer, his presence blanketing her trembling nerves with unexpected calm. His voice softened, though it carried an unyielding edge. "This place is no longer safe for you." She shook her head, tears threatening. "It's my home." His eyes held hers, dark with an emotion she couldn't yet name. "A home protects. This one does not." He lifted her chin gently with his hand. So careful, so reverent she felt the touch like a vow. "Pack your things," he whispered, the words a quiet thunder rolling through her bones. "You will stay with me." She stared up at him, breath shuddering, heart thundering in a way that wasn't fear at all. Something inside her, something lonely and weary and longing, leaned toward him like a flower seeking warmth. But before she could answer, a sharp crack echoed from the tree line. A gunshot. And this time, it wasn't a warning. The gunshot cracked through the dawn like a lightning bolt tearing the sky apart, its echo shuddering through the ridge until even the birds abandoned their branches in a frantic scatter of wings. Evelyn flinched, heart jolting, but Tewodi moved before fear fully reached her, sweeping her behind him with a single powerful motion. His body shielded hers entirely, a wall of warm living strength between her and whatever dangers spilled from the trees. Smoke drifted through the early light, curling above the brush. Another shot did not follow, only the whisper of wind carrying the faint metallic tang of spent powder. Tewodi kept her behind him as he angled toward the tree line, his every step measured, ready. But the forest answered with nothing but the soft creak of branches. Whoever had fired had already slipped back into the shadows. After several taut seconds, Tewodi exhaled, low and controlled, though tension still knotted his shoulders. "They're gone," he murmured, but the words offered little comfort. Gone did not mean harmless. Gone did not mean finished. Evelyn pressed a trembling hand to her chest, steadying her breath. "It was meant for us?" "For me," Tewodi said, glancing over his shoulder at her. "To scare. To warn." His jaw tightened. "Or to draw me away from you." The thought turned Evelyn's blood cold. She had known dangers circled her, but she had never imagined the lengths someone might take. She wrapped her arms around herself, the morning chill settling through her bones. "I can't stay here," she whispered, voice cracking under the weight of the truth she had resisted. "Not anymore." Tewodi turned fully to her then, the fierce edge in his gaze softening, as though her fear touched something deep inside him. He stepped closer, the dawn light carving gold along the planes of his chest, and cupped her cheek with a tenderness that unraveled her bracing. "Come," he said gently. "My people will guard you. I will guard you." She nodded, unable to trust her voice. He helped her gather her belongings. Few clothes, a worn quilt, her mother's cracked mirror, placing each item carefully into the trunk he lifted with ease. Evelyn paused at her bedroom doorway, letting her eyes sweep over the small space that had been refuge and prison in equal measure. A soft ache swelled inside her. She had fought loneliness here, survived heartbreak here, dreamed of nothing more than safety. But safety had become an illusion, and the presence waiting for her outside, steady, patient, unwavering, felt more like protection than these walls ever had. Tewodi secured the trunk with one arm and offered his other hand to her. She hesitated, but not because she feared him. Rather, because taking his hand felt like crossing into another future entirely. When her fingers slid into his palm, warmth surged up her arm, spreading through her chest like the first true sunrise she'd felt in years. They left the cabin behind, the ridge stretching long and open before them. Tewodi led her along a hidden trail that wove between tall pines and silent stones, each step carrying her farther from the life she'd known. Birds sang overhead, breaking the tension in gentle threads. Every so often, Tewodi glanced back to make sure she kept pace, his expression softening when their eyes met. After nearly an hour, they reached his camp, set in a quiet valley bathed in warm morning light. Tents stood in a half-circle, smoke rising from a central fire. Several Apache women looked up as they approached, their gazes curious but kind. Tewodi spoke to them in his language, low and respectful. Without hesitation, one of the women stepped forward, taking Evelyn's hand with a gentle smile, guiding her toward a small tent lined with blankets. The welcome was subtle but real, a warmth Evelyn had rarely felt from anyone. Tawodi set her trunk inside the tent, lingering at the entrance. Evelyn's pulse fluttered as she watched him, the giant figure who had become both storm and shelter in the span of days. His presence filled the space, not with intimidation, but with something that felt too careful, too reverent to ignore. When the women left them alone, a hush settled, heavy with words unsaid. "You are safe here," Tawodi said softly. "And you will not be alone tonight. Or any night after if you choose." His voice carried a tremor she had never heard before, as though speaking these words cost him some hidden piece of his guarded heart. Evelyn stepped closer, her breath catching. "Why are you doing this for me?" His eyes searched hers, deep and unwavering, as though he were finally weary of silence. "Because I have watched you carry your life like a wounded bird too afraid to rest. Because I see how brave you are, even when you think no one notices. Because loneliness follows you like a shadow, and it should not." His voice dipped lower, rougher. "And because the day I first saw you, I felt something in me steady. Like the land itself quieted." Her breath trembled, but she didn't look away. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" "I thought distance would protect you," he murmured. But distance only called danger closer. He reached for her hand slowly, as though expecting her to pull back. "I should not speak this now, when fear still wraps around you. But I cannot hold it any longer." His thumb brushed her knuckles with reverence. "Evelyn, I love you. Not because you need saving, but because your spirit is a fire I have watched from afar, warming everything around it. I would give my life to keep that fire lit." Her heart cracked open like the first thaw of spring. She stepped into him without thinking, resting her forehead against his chest. The steady rise and fall of his breath soothed her, grounding her. For the first time in years she felt held, not possessed, not claimed but cherished. "Tawodi," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm not afraid when you're near." His arms folded around her with a gentleness that contradicted every ounce of his strength. He rested his chin atop her hair. "Then stay," he murmured. "Let this be your home. Let me be your home." She closed her eyes, letting the warmth of his confession anchor her. Yet even as safety wrapped around her, a distant sound rose from the forest, faint footsteps, deliberate, approaching the camp with a darkness she recognized. They were not alone. And danger had followed her here.